Greetings. Welcome back to the second half of the program. In the first half, you got a glimpse of the 1968 demo and the team and the effort behind it. For the second half, we're going to set Doug's work in a broader context and get some different perspectives from different people, not all of whom participated directly in that event. Our next session is a conversation between John Markoff, senior writer for the New York Times, who frequently, faithfully, and fluently reports on information technology and innovations, and Bob Taylor. Bob was active everywhere in the surround of today's story. Trained as a psychologist, he followed JCR Licklider as director of the Information Processing Techniques Office at ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. In this capacity, he not only championed interactive computing, but he also funded Doug's work. He went on to found the Computer Science Laboratory at Xerox PARC, where his lab pursued another thread of this story, the networked personal computer. Please welcome John and Bob.
Hi, everyone. Can I be heard in the back? Is this loud enough? Great. I wanted to start with a personal introduction about Bob's work, because Bob was the first major funder of Doug's work as a young NASA program officer in the 1960s. He funded the work that would become the mouse, something that I think it took NASA a long time to realize that they had funded and created. He then funded Doug's work on the online system when he had moved on to ARPA, and which was the predecessor of today's DARPA, and he was at the Information Processing Techniques Office, which made the online system possible. He then conceived of and funded the ARPANET. I mean, you know, we talk about how many fathers the internet has, and I would like to make the case that this is the father that matters. He then funded the demo. He thought of and funded the demo. And then later at PARC, you know, he funded Alto. So that's just a breathtaking string of getting it right so many times. And he wasn't just a program manager. He wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was someone who was a visionary in his own right. And I would just commend you all to go to his paper that he wrote with JCR Licklider. It appeared in '68, I guess you wrote it in 1967. The computer is a communications device. That is getting it in a really big way. And he was there first, and that paper stands up very well. Go read, it's easy to do because it's on the web. Go read the last couple pages where he outlines what is sort of the model of the modern internet. And they have a wonderful description of something we don't have yet, an intelligent agent in that paper as well. So it's all there, and it's a sort of a stunning decade. What a long, strange trip it's been, to coin a phrase. Maybe we could start by talking about computing in the 60s. What was going on then? And my sense is that you were quite alone. You know, now everybody gets it. Then perhaps nobody got it. And so what was the... You know, when you came to NASA as a program manager, what were you trying to do?
Well, thank you for those nice words, John. And I want to thank SRI for inviting me to this event. In 1960, I read a paper written by JCR Licklider in the IEEE Transactions. The name of the paper was Man-Computer Symbiosis. And it opened my eyes to what a computer could do or be. When I was in graduate school, I had a thesis to do, and I had to compute a multidimensional analysis of variance, and I went to the computer center to get their help, and they told me about punching holes in cards. And I couldn't believe it. That I was going to have to sit at a key punch machine and punch this deck of cards, and I'd take the cards to the computer operator, who would tell me, okay, come back tomorrow or whenever, And I would go back and find out that in card number 631, I had mistyped something, and so the program had stopped. And I had to go fix up the cards and go through this process once again. It just seemed insane to me. I don't know why. It really. A year or so later, after reading this paper, where Licklider liked to be called Lick, he outlined what a partnership between a properly designed interactive computer and a human being could really be. A couple of years after reading it, I found myself as a program manager at NASA headquarters in their Office of Advanced Research and Technology, and unsolicited proposals would come across my desk. And there was this proposal called Augmenting the Human Intellect, that by someone at SRI whom I had never heard of. And I loved the ideas in this proposal. So I got in touch with this chap, and he came to see me in DC, and we got him started on a NASA contract, which was quite a bit larger funding than he had previously. So it kind of got him and his group off the ground. Then maybe a year or two later, Licklider came to ARPA and started ARPA's computer research program while I was still at NASA. And Licklider and I became acquainted. And I told him about Engelbart, and he began to fund Engelbart as well. And then later, when I went to ARPA, I increased the funding again. So from about 62 to 69, I was involved with Doug and his work. Now, the amazing thing, and one amazing thing about all this, John asked about what was computing like in those days. Computing was, in those days, believed to be for arithmetic. That's it. Data processing, numbers, calculating payrolls, calculating ballistic missile trajectories, numbers. And I wasn't interested in numbers, and neither was Doug. And it was clear from reading this proposal. And furthermore, Doug and his group were able to take off-the-shelf computer hardware and transform what you could do with it through software. Now, software is much more difficult for people generally to understand than hardware. Hardware, you can pick it up and touch it and feel it and see what it looks like and weigh it and so on. Software is much more mysterious. And it's true that Doug's group did some hardware innovation, which you all know about, but their software innovation was truly remarkable. I'm reminded that of a story. I don't know if it's probably not true, but NASA was evaluating the weight requirements for one of its manned space vehicles. And they were going around to the subcontractors who were furnishing the equipment. And they said, we have to know how much the computer weighs. And so they were taken over to where the computer was, and they weighed it. Fine. And then they said, well, what about the software? How much does that weigh? And they were told the software doesn't weigh anything. And the fellow didn't believe him. And he went away, but he came back a couple of days later, and he was very angry, and he said, you didn't tell me the truth. He said, I looked into this software question, and they showed me boxes that were very heavy. They had cards in them with holes punched in them. He said, that's the software. And he was told, well, no, the software's in the holes.
So how much of a gamble was it? Do you remember Doug as being someone who was, out in left field in terms of existing computer science when you funded him? Did you have any of that sense? I continually hear this notion that the perception that Doug was doing office automation, but real men did artificial intelligence. Were you swimming upstream in any way when you?
Yes, but it's all relative in some sense, because even the computer establishment in those days was dedicated to batch processing. ARPA, it's true that a few people under ARPA sponsorship were beginning to develop time sharing, which would give you interactive computing. But at the computer conferences, for example, like the fall joint computer conferences held every fall on the West Coast, and the spring joint computer conferences held in the spring on the East Coast, there are always, at these conferences, panel discussions attacking time sharing and attacking the idea of interactive computing. The reasons were multitudinous. They'd say, well, it's too expensive. Computer time is worth more than human time. It'll never work. It's a pipe dream. So the great majority of the public, including the computing establishment, were not only ignorant and would be opposed to what Doug was trying to do, they were also opposed to the whole idea of interactive computing. Then a few years later, in 1966, I started a project in ARPA called the ARPANET, which came online in 1969. About 1967, I invited IBM to join this to-be-held experiment as a node in the ARPANET, and they said, we're not interested, our computers can already talk to each other.
That was something you fought beyond IBM, right? Individual researchers within the ARPA community were not wild on sharing.
I'll get to that.
Okay.
I went to AT&T Bell Labs and I said, I'd like for you to become a node on this network. It won't cost you anything. It's going to be the first interactive computer network. And they looked into some of the specs and they said, packet switching won't work. We're not interested. So it's very nice after 40 years later, to see Doug and all that work properly rewarded. At SRI in those days, Doug was also having problems. His manager, early on in the NASA support, came to see me, which was unusual. Came to see me in my office in Washington, and he said, I want to talk to you about Doug. He said, why are you funding him? And, well, I said, because he's trying to do something that's very important and that nobody else is trying to do, and I believe in it. And I got the sense that this fellow felt that Doug was ethereal in some fashion or another, and he wanted to see if his funding source was also ethereal. Because if the funding source disappeared, well, then the manager would be in trouble. So I did the best I could to make a good sales pitch as to why he should support Doug, and it worked out okay. So there were obstacles of all sorts, and did I feel alone? Yes, and Doug and the few people who were working on interactive computing or the ARPANET or the Augment system also felt alone. And even within that, the community of people who were doing work on interactive computing, there was probably a pecking order of some sort. There always is. And Doug's group at that time, before this demo, was probably at the bottom of that pecking order. that's just the way it was, folks. I mean, it was very frustrating. Doug and I talked about doing this demo in early '68, and I was strongly encouraging Doug to do it. He said, it's going to cost a fortune. He says, we're going to bring in this huge display, and we're going to have online support between San Francisco and Menlo Park, and it's going to cost a ton of money. I said, don't worry about it. He said, ARPA will pay for it. A year or two after this demo, which was, as you know, a marvelous success, Doug told me a story that I hadn't known about until he told me. He said there was a contracting officer. Government contracts have people who work for the government who are local to the contractor's place, who come around and check on the expenditures to make sure they're spending the government's money properly and so on. He said a contracting officer, Doug is telling me this, came to me before the demo, sometime before the demo, and had seen the budget numbers for this demo. And he asked, what was this all about? And Doug told him, and the contracting officer just shook his head in disbelief, and he said, if this thing comes off, I'm going to deny knowing anything about it.
So, collective intelligence has become quite the buzzword. Google's PageRank algorithm is probably the best example of the fact that you can actually make money off of this big time. Doug came to you with a proposal that had both an aspect of collective intelligence and it had an aspect of interface, sort of changing the nature of the way we talk to computing. Were you attracted by both right from the start? I'm asking because I have this sense that you understood the importance of community early on, and whether you saw that aspect in Doug's research right from the start.
I think the thing that I was most attracted to was the fact that he was going to use computers in a way that people had not to, as he put it, augment human intellect. I mean, that's about as succinct a phrase as I can think of to describe it. He was interested in knowledge. He was interested in sifting knowledge and categorizing knowledge. And he was interested in cooperative editing, cooperative composition. These kinds of things were more interesting to me than the nature of the interface at that time. I mean, the interface was a normal television set. The mouse, of course, and the keyboard were innovations, but the television set wasn't. And that television set, as you saw, was driven by a camera looking at a cathode ray tube that was generated by the computer. So your analog to digital conversion was a camera looking at a tube. And it worked marvelously.
Yeah, that's the very definition of Rube Goldberg, I believe.
Yeah, right,
yeah.
right.
So,
Bill English is the miracle worker of most of that thing, that sort of thing.
I wanted you to tell one story. I want to ask you several stories, but the one story that really struck me is how the idea, the obviousness of the idea of the ARPANET came to you. And I believe it happened when you took your new job at IPTO. And can you tell that story? Because it speaks to where innovation comes from, I think.
Okay, well, prior to my going from NASA to ARPA, Licklider had started this program at ARPA in '62, and Ivan Sutherland has succeeded him in '64, I believe, and then Ivan hired me as his deputy in '65, and then Ivan left, and I was left in charge. Now, Lick had earlier started research funding at UC Berkeley, System Development Corporation in Santa Monica, California, and Project Mac at MIT. And all these three places had experimental time-sharing systems that were being built by ARPA support. They all three had terminals in my offices in ARPA. So if I wanted to log on to one of those systems, I would go sit at the terminal for that system. And if I wanted to log on to another system, I would get up from that terminal and go over to another terminal and sit and do the same thing with, of course, different command languages for different systems. Well, any idiot would see that this is silly. I have one terminal and let's have it connect to whatever system it's capable of connecting to. So that was one motivation, but there were others. In visiting, I visited these places that we were funding frequently, and I would often run in, and I would talk to the people who were doing research there, and I would often run into a set of interests at one place that were shared by someone or two or three people at another place, and again at another place. Well, why can't these folks share interest on a common network? Also a no-brainer. And so we did something we hadn't done previously, and that is we initiated a piece of research rather than respond to unsolicited proposals, which is what we had normally done. And that project was the ARPANET.
Now, you didn't talk about the resistance from the ARPA community to the ARPANET, but there was not an easy sell, right?
No, that's right. In fact, it goes back to something that was said before the break. Someone asked a question about Doug and the Network Information Center, which served the ARPANET. In 1967, let me back up. Every year I would have and Ivan before me and Lick before him would have an annual contractors meeting where the principal investigators of all the contractors would come and meet for a day or two or three. I like to have these meetings at attractive places, like we had one in New Orleans during Mardi Gras.
Alta was a favorite place.
And we had one at the ski lodge in Salt Lake City during skiing season. And we had one at the University of Hawaii in the wintertime. And the agendas for those meetings were we would work in the morning, we would play in the afternoon, and we would work at night. So we could take advantage of whatever was there. Well, in New Orleans, I think we played at night, and worked in the daytime. Now, at one of these meetings in 1967, I announced for the first time to the group of contractors assembled that we were going to start this ARPANET research program. But in fact, we had already started it, but we didn't need their cooperation yet until we were closer to being up and running. And so I invited them all to become nodes on this ARPANET. They all had their individual computer systems, and I was proposing to interconnect them. And many of them, I would say probably the majority of them, were skeptical, to be polite. They said, we don't want somebody else coming in using our machine cycles. We don't have enough machine cycles as it is. And now you're proposing to make it possible for us to give up even more of them. Doug, almost standing alone, said, this is a great idea. SRI and my group will be the Network Information Center, which will handle all the information about the ARPANET so that people who want to find out about getting on the ARPANET or finding out the location of information on the net, they can come to us. So he was true to form, an early supporter, and consequently SRI was one of the first 4 nodes, as you heard before the break.
So your ARPA of the 1960s, do you think that there are lessons in the way you did research or the way you funded research that we could take forward? Is there something that's been lost in that maybe now we're at this branch point, we have a chance to rethink the way the nation does research?
That's an interesting idea. ARPA ARPA was created by the Department of Defense at the instigation of Eisenhower when the nation was caught unawares of Sputnik in 1957. And the idea was that the Defense Department would launch an agency that would support high-risk research with no red tape and would have a lot of leverage in deciding what it would support without committees evaluating this proposal or that proposal. Just go and do it. And that spirit was still there when I was in ARPA. That spirit has gradually decayed over the years, I'm told. I haven't received any ARPA support since I left ARPA, but I have a lot of friends who have, and they tell me and continue to tell me that it's just not the same thing. Now, if you want good research to be done, you better give your researchers a lot of room, a lot of possibility of taking initiative, and not try to hamstring them by giving them milestones or targets of various kinds, or too many progress reports, or one restriction after another after another. Good researchers won't do good research under those conditions. I guess that's, to answer your question, that's as briefly as I can without getting on a big soapbox. That's my response.
That's perfect. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There are 10 more stories I'd like Bob to tell us, but not today.
I have one more.
Okay, one last story.
When I was in ARPA, a couple of my bosses over the time I was there were physicists, and they were wonderful, really bright, creative, imaginative people. Bob Sproul's father, incidentally, was one of them, oddly enough. For example, when they would go to Congress to testify for the ARPA budget, unlike later ARPA directors, when they asked my Congress, well, what does this piece of research in computing technology have to do with the Defense Department? It doesn't have anything to do with the mission of the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. And they would respond, this kind of research that ARPA is supporting in its basic research programs is not just for the Defense Department, it's for the nation. And if we're successful, the whole nation will profit from it. And that shut them up. And it's the right answer. Now, later at Xerox PARC, I had another couple of physicists who were my bosses. They were not so good. And they reminded me of one of my favorite stories. As a result, I built a lot of stories about physicists. And they reminded me of one of my favorite stories, which I'll end this session on. The time this takes place is of the French Revolution. And the guillotine is set up in a huge square, and there are thousands of people surrounding the guillotine to watch the events. And a priest is led up to the guillotine, and he says, I want to be put into this guillotine face up so I can watch my maker as the blade falls. And so they put him in face up, and the executioner pulls the trigger, and the blade comes crashing down, and it stops inches before it gets to the man's neck. And the crowd is stunned, and then it goes wild and says, you must set him free. God means for him to be set free. He must be innocent. So they set him free. The next fellow to come up to the guillotine was a physicist. He probably supported royalty to an excess. I don't know. And they put him in face up, and he's lying there looking up at the guillotine. And just before the executioner pulls the trigger, the physicist says, I see your problem.
Jim, Bob, thank you.